One. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Today we have a very special guest. We have done a lot of interviews lately on our channel, usually with our cast, but today we have a special guest, Dr. Emily Friedman, historian, TTRPG researcher, lover, and all that. So thank you for joining us. If you have questions, Twitter or Discord. My lovely co-host Hope is here today.
Yay!
Oh, hello, hi. I'm just like, yes, I'm here.
Yes, you're just nodding. I think perhaps I'll go over to Hope to ask the first questions. If you're ready to get started, Emily.
Yeah, absolutely. So excited to be here.
Yay! All right, let's get to it.
I think first, before we hop into all the really awesome questions and things, I would love to just ask you, for those who don't know, who you are and what you'd like to be known for.
Oh boy. Hi, I'm Emily Friedman. I'm an associate professor of English at Auburn University in the middle of Alabama. That's a state university and about 90 minutes from Atlanta. I was trained as a scholar of 18th century popular culture, including the illegitimate theater and the rise of the novel. So I spent my 20s reading extremely long novels, which is how I became an expert in really long other forms. So these days I balance my time between two big projects. One is on never published fiction between 1750 and 1900 that I'm calling the kind of prehistory of fan fiction. And alongside that, I have been becoming one of the historians of tabletop actual play, and I'm probably best known, and I'm here because I'm one of the most senior scholars in the field doing this work. There's lots of amazing graduate and what we call early career researchers who are doing this work, but I'm the one who's got the job and the platform to help kind of promote this as a new field of study.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I'd love to delve in a little bit about your work with the writing women in Great Britain and North America. I think that's absolutely fascinating. I'd love to see, like, how has that helped you with playing and researching TTRPG? Like, do you actually bring that in when you play, like, with your characters and stuff?
Yeah, in a couple ways. One is the reason why I can do any of this, like do the work of public scholarship, is because I've had the amazing example of one of my dissertation co-directors, who's a renowned Jane Austen scholar, who's also plays roller derby under the name Stone Cold Jane Austen. And she has spent her career using Austen and her big popular platform to elevate the stories of women writers. So right now, she just put out a joint biography of two sisters who were direct contemporaries of Jane Austen. Jane and Anna Maria Porter. If you know the movie Braveheart, the Mel Gibson movie, that's based on a early 19th century novel by Jane Porter that was a big blockbuster in its day. So I learned kind of from an early age in my training that we could use the kind of connections between the pop culture and today to, elevate literary study, especially the study of kind of forgotten women writers and other forgotten writers of color, that sort of thing. So my degree that you mentioned is my master's degree from the University of York in the UK. And so that was where I first learned about not only a lot of the history of women writers, people who were publishing before Jane Austen, long before Jane Austen, who were part of what Cliff Siskin calls the Great Forgetting. They got erased by literary history. And so I became really interested in how does literary history get remembered and told, and what gets lost. And this is also, I studied what was called illegitimate theater with the great scholar Jane Moody, who died quite young. And illegitimate theater was the stuff that the royal playhouses would not authorize because of political content or sexual content, or, they couldn't get through censorship. And if those of you, if you are in the Southern California area, you can go and find out about all of these plays and how they did or didn't get through the censors at the Huntington Library. So you can have a beautiful day trip and see what censorship had wrought. And so what you did in the 18th century was, if you couldn't go on the main stages, you went to the coffee house and you charged for a cup of coffee or hot chocolate, and you put on what we might think of now as either improv or stand-up or a shorter form theatrical production in the middle of basically Starbucks, right? And so I've known about these kinds of phenomenon since I was, in my early 20s. And so as actual play starts to arise and I start teaching about it and I start thinking about it with my students, I realize, oh, this is another form of history in the making. And I know how much we've lost about popular culture in the 18th century because nobody thought it was important to remember. We have to start now remembering and recording. And so that was when I was like, okay, so the manuscripts are safe. They are in the archive. They will wait for a while I talk to creators and gather data and look at electronic files that might vanish and immerse myself and talk to my students about it. And it's a beautiful moment in the hobby and in the art form to work on it with students because it's being made largely by people around my age for people my students' age. So it's a lovely kind of harmony that we've got going. It was a long answer origin story, but I hope this is just a fair warning, audience. This is how it goes. You ask a professor a question, you get a mini lecture.
No worries. I love it. And actually, I have a little bit of a follow-up question. Do you ever feel overwhelmed nowadays in present day? There's just so much overflow of content that how do you keep up with it? How do you make sure it's all seen and remembered?
Yeah, I mean, and I think that's a real challenge, right? And so one of the ways I do it is I work with a team. So that's why I teach actual play and TTRPGs. So basically the way that our workflow works in the classroom is we watch some actual plays, usually one shots or episodes together to talk about and listen to them, right? Like, because there are podcast versions too, and say, okay, so what are we listening for? What are the features that we're trying to focus on? And then I send them out and we have a big Google Doc. It got updated today. It is 1,400 shows, and that is just the tip of the iceberg of what's out there. But those are people who've been submitted to audiofiction.co.uk, or they've submitted to us, or we've found them. All the official Wizards of the Coast content from the past has been in there, all those sorts of things. And so students look at the first episode of each show, and they look at the first 20 to 30 minutes, and then they look at the show as a whole kind of to get other kinds of features. So that, this is what we call distant reading in some ways, as opposed to close reading that like looks at details really specifically. We're trying to get a sense of like, what are the patterns over time? And the other thing that's really useful for is the students have different tastes than I do. So they can tug on my sleeve and say, hey, Dr. Friedman, you should pay attention to this. This is doing something interesting, right? And one of the challenges, right, is in the past, for better and for worse and for different, there was different kinds of methodologies for circulating your work. If you were really just trying to get it to a certain small group of people versus you had ambitions, right? Now everybody's on Twitch, right? Everybody's on YouTube. Everybody can get a podcast distributor, throw stuff on SoundCloud or other kinds of podcatchers and that sort of thing. So it's hard to tell. And one of the things that I've been trying to figure out is, how do we distinguish? It's easy to know when something is commercial, right? And it's getting a lot easier, right? Because there's lots of money there's a reasonable amount of money behind it, and certain kinds of labor gets put in, and there's backstage labor and all those sorts of things. But the ambitious middle is the thing that's hard to kind of easily clock. And that's That's the research project right now, honestly, is figuring out how do I tell the difference between people who are just like throwing whatever on the internet and, you know, if they find an audience, great, that's great, versus the people who are really looking for an audience, really making artistic choices with intention, trying to communicate something, whether they've got an audience or not. And I think, and that's an ongoing research question right now. And so we just look at everything. Anything that somebody sends me, I will look at least the first 20 minutes.
Wow. That's a lot of dedication.
Yeah, you can tweet me at FRIEDE until
Let's
Twitter
do it.
dies.
Come on, Damien, let's do it.
I think I have before. So yeah.
It's on I believe I can send you my Spotify list of things people have recommended to me. And I keep it and I make it available and I can retweet it out. To kind of get a sense of these are the people who are proud enough of their work that they have sent me an episode that they're really proud of. And I'm always excited to look at that.
That's incredible because, I mean, I work in the film industry and I know agents and publishers and stuff that they have stacks and stacks of like scripts and stuff that sit on there and they just toss them. They don't look at them. They don't, they don't make time for it. And the fact that you do is huge.
Well, I mean, what I've said is like, what I realized recently is like for us, that big monster list is the slush pile, is that stack of scripts, is that, a literary journal gets, blind submissions and that sort of thing. And this is where junior colleagues, having undergraduates working with me on this research who care about this stuff, doing those first passes so that it can get pulled up from the slush and say, oh, this is something worthy of attention. And I don't presume, and so one of the things I try to do with Polygon, which I write freelance for, is trying to move in a little bit more into curated, like, best of lists. I hate the phrase best of, but if it gets more people to see more shows beyond the 2 that can get coverage guaranteed on the tabletop side, fabulous. And so what I've been trying to do more is think thematically, is like, how do I slice off a group of shows and say, in October, the horror shows, right? That's a smaller subset. Or right now I'm thinking a lot about, because I have a almost 8-year-old nephew that I'm going to see next month and a 4-year-old niece, and they're playing tabletop games. I'm like, oh, I know there are tabletop games that are either specifically designed being performed for kids or are being billed as family friendly. I should take a listen to those and see, like, are there ones that seem to be particularly noteworthy that, more people should hear about? And so that's also how I kind of slice it off, is like, I'll ask a specific question, like, I am desperate as someone who lives in the Deep South to find more actual plays that are engaging with ideas of the South that are not stereotypes, right? And obviously, like, the Atlanta folks down the road with ATL by Night and everything are doing the work. But I'm curious about other examples of that. So I'm always excited to hear about those. I can tell you I am well nigh allergic to anyone who's pitched to me, because I now get pitches in my email of, hey, my 4 white guy friends have decided we're going to, in the year of our Lord 2023, start an actual play podcast. And get this, we're gonna play Dungeons and Dragons and it's gonna be funny. Like, congratulations. There is some market saturation. Please tell me how else you're gonna differentiate, because that ain't it, friends. That ain't it. I try not to be salty, but that's the one thing where it's like, I'm gonna need another step in that development for you to get me to care.
We encourage salt here. It's fine.
Hey, we're good. It's late night here in Alabama.
Damien?
Oh, sure. Yes. Thank you.
Damien finally gets a question.
Absolutely fascinating. Yeah. I'll go to the Twitch chat. I think this is a question for all of us, but Bookish Oddish asks, how aware were you all of each other before the Twitter conversation about land acknowledgements? So I think us 3. Because I remember that was probably the first time I actually, like, talked to you on Twitter, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, I think I've, kind of been like peeking in at hope, I think kind of, through the window sort of way, in that one way Twitter sort of form, for, I don't even want to think about, I'm sure Twitter has some diagnostic that can tell how long I've been Twitter stalking. But yeah, I mean, and I think that, I know recent visibility, for me, both with some big pieces in Polygon. I started writing for Polygon in the summer of last year. So that's not when I kind of began being immersed in the community by any stretch of the imagination, but the community began getting more immersed in me. And I went from being kind of a beneficiary of other people's generosity, like when I taught my first TTRPG class in this fall of 21, someone was like, "Oh, B. Dave Walters will come to your class." And I was like, "He will?" And he did. And Anna Bria did, and Amy Carrero did, and Tim Hutchings did. And it was great. Yeah. Wow. My favorite story is I found out a semester later that some former students of mine were talking about the class in the kind of writing tutorial area of the library, and another student who wasn't in the class overheard this class had existed and burst into tears. So this class fills in an hour every time it's offered, and it's been offered in one form or another every fall, and it'll be offered again next fall. Luckily we either are kind of early morning LA time, or this time it'll be lunchtime LA time. So usually with, people's weird and wacky schedules, we can have folks drop in. And it's been through the power of Zoom. And it's been really lovely. But yeah, so I mean, it's definitely like, hi, I think you're neat, kind of stuff.
Well, I have to add to that with, I curate my Twitter very specifically to only see Dungeons and Dragons / TTRPG things. So it is, I don't see anything outside of that. And if I do, I'm just like, I don't know if I want to see this. I want to keep it positive.
Fair.
And just in the community. That's the only thing I use Twitter for, is just for that. So when I see like your posts that do come through my feed, and you always have such interesting takes about things. And
thank you.
So right back at you. A little
yay. Yeah, it's been really lovely. Somebody, there was like a couple of days ago, the kind of perpetual cycle question came around of like, at what number are you a big deal in tabletop? And and of course you immediately get smart people like Jen Kretschmer saying, but for what purpose, right? What is Twitter for you? Like, are you, say, somebody who's trying to boost the algorithms on your clickbait rage tweet, like YouTube content, so that you can monetize people's upsetness? Then you're going to need one kind of number, right? And I've always said, I get really nervous when numbers get high. Like for academics, 5,000 is big. So when I passed that, I was like, oh no, because I've had friends who've been fired for Twitter presence.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, in my department, someone lost their job not that long ago, before they even got to start, because somebody got mad about them on a completely innocuous topic on Twitter, which then led state officials to become aware of their other political positions, and it escalated from there. So I'm always keenly aware of like being visible is a push me pull you, right? It's a, and unlike many public figures, as a state employee, where I work is public, when I work is public, a lot of my personal information can't be scrubbed in the same way that some of my friends and colleagues in entertainment can erase themselves in different kinds of ways. So it's something that I think about a lot, but I have said that I'm at the level that I'm happy with, because the people whose work I respect and enjoy and want to honor and want to be in conversation with, big and small, are in the conversation with me and hopefully Twitter will get to some kind of equilibrium that makes that possible. But I was actually talking about this with a colleague today, like what happens if Twitter imploded tomorrow? And luckily, we've been worried enough about this for long enough that people who I really respect have been like, here's my email address and here's my other socials. And I want to make sure that because your research is something that we care about, that we're still in conversation. And I point people to my website. I have a mailing list that's just for if you want updates about my research, and if you want to participate in things like the tabletop survey that I'm hopefully putting out very soon. We're waiting for the official safety approval.
Oh, nice.
Going through the institutional research board so that I can guarantee you're not going to be asked any questions that will cause you more trauma than walking down the street. Unless you're really triggered by talking about D&D, in which case, take care of yourself. Don't fill out my survey. But yeah, so no, that's, Twitter's a weird beast. Social media is a weird beast. And academics have gotten into like influencer / content creator game in the same kinds of ways that everybody else has, which makes for a really interesting research life when you're dealing with living people as opposed to the safely dead.
That is very true. I didn't think about that. That actually rolls kind of into my next question in regards to your work with Is It Thursday Yet? Really cool piece. How do you feel about technology causing TTRPGs to be more theater of the mind, and less about using tools, maps, and minis and thing? How do you feel that that's affected the game?
Yeah, it's super interesting, right? Especially when there's this kind of, I think, latent anxiety that the game is in danger of becoming a video game, right? That like somehow one D&D is going to take this over the edge and pull us into territory that we don't want to go into. And I guess my sense is that I think about it the same way that at the beginning of my career, people were really, really concerned that by the time that we're talking right now, books would no longer exist. We would all read on screens. You know the argument, right? And yet we are now living in a time when record sales are higher than it's ever been in my lifetime. And people buy physical books, in part because we're now starting to realize, right, both the pleasures of tactility, right, that of holding things. Like I have my dice all right next to me, even though I also use virtual tools for my home games and I play online on Zoom. But also the fact that digital is also material in certain kinds of ways, and in fact more fragile than physical. And I think that what's interesting is that we're coming to a moment where I think people are more aware of that than ever before. And so I think we're going to continue to see people, and I think this is both on the performance side as well as on the play side, of people deciding what they need for the use case they need, right? Like I find it really interesting. And since you brought up my first article, which is on Critical Role has made the Dimension 20 move of like going in and doing that zoom in at the mini view that Dimension 20 has used for years. And Dimension 20, of course, such a hallmark of their style of play is physical minis that they make hundreds of thousands of dollars off selling them at auction. And so I think that there's going to be some games that say, the cost of a separate camera and thinking in those kinds of spatial ways on top of if we want to do studio is going to be cost prohibitive for the kind of story we want to tell or that we can tell at this point. And so maybe we'll use VTT. Maybe we'll get a sponsor that's a VTT. Maybe we'll simulate the experience of physicality in those kinds of ways, like the way that Johnny Stanton is using alchemy. But I think there's also a place for theater of the mind. I think it's not for nothing that podcasts are such a big part of the actual play space, where you can't have minis. You have to rely on the delivery of your voice and the descriptions that you kind of put into it in order to tell the story. There are things mechanically you can't do in the same kinds of ways, and that's it. But I think that's in the same way that there's lots of different kinds of theater, right? There's lots of different kinds of performance. There's stripped down black box, and then there's hyper realistic sets and a whole bunch of flats, and the National Theater with their giant drum that can make a whole ship come out of nowhere, right? Not every stage has to rain. Not every table has to have minis. So this is me saying it's complicated, which of course is a very academic thing for me to say.
It's perfect though. It's the truth.
I try. That is what I try to do. I try not to lie and not to assume that I know what the hell I'm talking about everything.
Damien?
Yes, I will ask a question now from Fallen Angel, one of our big fans.
Hi, Fallen Angel.
And fantastic. I will ask, why do you think role-playing games makes it possible for us to delve into our personalities and discover different parts of ourselves that we don't acknowledge every day? It's quite a deep question.
Oh, that's an amazing question, right? And there are lots of scholars who've kind of explored what that kind of, performance experience. Like I think of my colleague, Evan Torner, who is the great LARP historian, right? Because LARP studies is so mature at this point, right? And so we have these ideas of like, how do we handle bleed? That bleed is not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a thing that we have to manage. And I think that, there's a certain kind of freedom in certain forms of play, right? Like if you came to my D&D and Dad's all history table looking for immersive character work, you would probably run screaming into the night, right? That's a tactics game in many ways. With a few people going, what's my motivation? I would like to have a character moment, please. And so, but I think for people who do want to kind of have that emotional experience, it's a way of kind of having a certain amount of distance. There's obviously been some studies that talk about the ways in which folks who have marginalized identities can, at safe tables, explore those identities, and try them on, right? We can safely try on kind of different ways of being in the world. I am of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. And so one of the things, and then another part of my family is of the Akkadian diaspora. So I'm going to assume that nobody knows who the Akkadians are. The Akkadians were the French who initially immigrated to Canada and then were forced down to Louisiana. So they are kind of multiply displaced folks, also tied to colonialism, but that's the shorthand. And so a lot of my characters explore what does it mean to be somebody who's from somewhere that can't exist anymore, or who have had to change their names or those sorts of things. Yeah. And that's, and that looks different in different kinds of ways. And those are things I would also say that I don't necessarily think I would ever perform on a stream. But in the space of my home table are ideas that I can explore with trusted friends. And I think that's incredibly valuable. If you're curious about the scholarship that I'm talking about, you can go to Crit Roll Bib on Twitter, which has the link to, it's called Crit Roll Bib because it started out as a collection of Critical Role scholarship, but it's also actual play scholarship more generally and tabletop scholarship even more broadly than that. And that's a good place to get started on some of these kinds of issues, if you're curious. And for everything possible, we've put a publicly available link for free so that you can go find it. You can go find that source and read it for yourself. It's very cool. We've got everything from like senior undergraduate theses to doctoral dissertations and beyond.
Wow.
That's incredible. What a great resource.
Yeah.
Wow, thank you for that.
Great answer too. Thank you.
Thank you.
It kind of rolls into my next question, actually, quite nicely. A little bit more of a fun question. Do you have a favorite character that you've played, and what are they like?
Ooh.
Yes. So I have this near to me, so I will just play with this. So this is my Artificer's robot pangolin.
Oh my god, it's so cute. Yes.
Yeah.
Penguins are awesome.
So this is like, there was also a conversation, I think, on Twitter about the character you wish you could play more. So my home DM is the father of small children. And so we were in the middle of Waterdeep, and that's a very open world kind of campaign. And he was like, I can't prep like this right now. Can we please put this on hold for a bit and play something more straightforward? And he basically, went back to his kind of habit of taking old adventures from prior editions and tweaking them. So we all had to make new characters. So I had to leave my lovely Sparky behind, who is a gnome artificer. And she was just about to get to level 3, where she gets to kind of do the class specification of being a battlesmith and having a pangolin. But luckily, during that break, I was on one of the Jasper's Game Day streams with Amy Dolan for the pancake game. And so I brought Sparky out of retirement. So you can actually watch that if you're curious. Sparky did a great job. And we for a donation, we let chat name my Robo Pangolin, who of course became named Pancake. So when we get to play again at home, Sparky and Pancake will have great adventures.
I love that.
Yeah. I maybe we'll have to invite you on sometime, and you can bring Pancake with you. Yes,
no, I would be happy to. I am guesting on an unspecified non-D&D charity stream in a couple of weeks, reprising a role I'd played on that stream before, and it's this kind of vaguely hated, not really a bad guy, but got into some, was the catalyst for some emotional trauma for the home party. So it'd be nice to just play a chipper little gnome who's got a protective buddy.
I love it.
My question, from the Twitch, Shalrath42.
Hi, Shalrath.
It's a very interesting question, actually. Blogs/forums/websites, etc., have already disappeared. How do we ensure this emerging format does not? And that's quite an interesting question. So I guess it's kind of like saying, do we have is it possible to have something like an internet Wayback Machine kind of for actual plays if they disappear? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that welcome to the question that haunts my nightmares. Thank you, Shala. And so this is how recovery and this is how scholarship works, right? The first step is to make the case to the scholarly and to the larger community, which is also to say funding organizations and things like that something is worthy of study. And that's basically what I'm trying to do with my Polygon writing and with my scholarship at this point in time. Because I do agree, we are in danger. If YouTube goes away tomorrow, if podcast catchers go away, we've actually already lost stuff from the early history of the form.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I mean, and some of that is kind of the liminal space stuff. So yesterday I was looking into the Dungeon Majesty, which was not online initially, but was a LA-based public access television show that ran from 2004 to 2010. Not that long ago. That was after I left college, right? For me, that's yesterday. But we only have a little bit of its footprint left online, and it was hugely popular. It had 1 million downloads of some of its content. It had live shows, right? It had fan mail, it had all of the things that we associate with a successful actual play today. And it was all women players.
Was it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, we can get, I don't want to get too far into the weeds on it, but it is interesting. Like, it ends and then I hit it with my axe, which is much harder to tell the public story of, because many of the people who have been involved are persona non grata in the hobby, which is also another male DM, female, that got more press attention, especially compared to how long it ran compared to, but yeah, I mean, and so what's most fascinating about Dungeon Majesty is it had a Wikipedia entry, which then was deleted after a substantial debate because it was no longer considered notable. What? And the Dungeon Majesty website literally screenshots all of the Wikipedia debate among the Wikipedians about the notability of Dungeon Majesty. And basically it was like, well, it was only in 2 markets and it was a public access show, so it doesn't matter. Even though it's, you know, one of the first pieces of digital evidence we have of what's going to become actual play, right? It's the kind of evolutionary link from the LA improv scene and convention play that preceded what we think of now as actual play, right? It gets us to that point. And this is where I'm like, not everything is on the internet, not everything is on Wikipedia, because Wikipedians notoriously, and this is where we get back to my training in women writers, have a tendency to call things not notable, especially if they're women writers.
Shit, yes.
Indeed. Yeah. So I've been fighting this on like multiple, I was like, so the short answer is what we need is something like the Strong Museum of Play, which is a museum dedicated to the study of play in all of its forms. To recognize actual play is important. We need some place like the Clark Library at UCLA, which is not far from the epicenter of a lot of this creative production, to say, let's start ingesting things like DM's notes or production Bibles or whatever scraps of material. We have to get people whose shows end to realize that what they're sitting on is history, not garbage from something that didn't work out, right? This is my public plea, right? And so I think if everything went south tomorrow, we'd probably have the archives of Critical Role. We'd probably have the archives of Dimension 20. What we are in grave danger of losing is the huge group of creatives who are tied to those in different kinds of networked ways, whose production is far more kind of less, it's not institutionalized, right? Or it was institutionalized in a way where it was one person's company and that person was not great, or didn't feel like he was important, or died, or, you know, any number of things can happen. So yeah, I mean, this is an archiving opportunity very comparable to something that happened at Texas A&M. So Texas A&M is one of the premier places that you can go to study the history of science fiction and fantasy. And that's because of AggieCon. AggieCon is a science fiction and fantasy convention run by students that brought in a whole bunch of people before they were considered a big deal elsewhere. And so you had people like George R.R. Martin coming to AggieCon year over year. And he has this garage full of papers. And this is before HBO. This is before all of those things. And they say, hey, your wife doesn't want your stuff in your garage anymore. We'll pay to ship it to Texas and we'll take good care of it. Wow. And so they sign an agreement with George R.R. Martin and many other fantasy authors to say, hey, we'll take your boxes of papers. Whenever you get done with the project, we'll take custody of them. We'll process them. We'll make them available to scholars. You can embargo them, which means that nobody can take a look at them until a certain point. And that's how I've seen The Wall for real, which is a 30 some odd wide, 17-foot high wall of George R.R. Martin's papers, boxes, and later on, all the production material for Game of Thrones.
Wow. Okay. Wow.
And all the translations of his work and everything else. And there's also a copy of the Iron Throne, and their reading room is the only reading room I know that has fantasy swords in it.
Oh, cool.
So the moral of that story is they did that before HBO, right? If they'd gone to him after HBO, this probably would have been worth a fortune, and HBO probably would have not allowed it, right? But because of the pre-existing agreement, HBO, the only thing they could say was, well, we have to put an embargo on stuff. You can't make stuff available to researchers until after a certain point. And that's the kind of collecting visionary we need somewhere to start collecting something. I don't know if we have a hope of collecting all of the performances, right? In some ways, the challenge is what we're looking at is so many terabytes of data.
Exabytes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I once tried to calculate the number of hard drives today that we would need to get one campaign of one show, and then my head exploded. But we also don't have all of the performances from the 18th century, but we have a lot of stuff, including prompt books. So like the scripts that the actors used, including things like lighting cues. We have images from what the sets looked like. We have reviews. We have the papers of actors. So we can at least start to collect that kind of thing. We can at least start to collect things like transcripts and that sort of thing. And this is where captioning also becomes something really useful for history. And so that's the kind of medium term dream, is that we get to that point where the Library of Congress comes knocking and saying, okay, what are the most important for our cultural history? What are the actual plays? This form is legit. What are the important, and then my head's gonna explode in a different kind of way, because then I'll have to be like, oh, what do we rescue off the ark? And that's gonna be hard too. But that's hopefully future our problem. I want that to be our problem. I want us to sit down and be able to say, okay, so what were the hallmarks of this? And that's what I'm trying to do right now, is write the kind of, here's how to read this form, here's why this form is important. Here's some examples of close readings from different moments to convince you this is important and innovative. And so that other people can go and do more close readings, can go do more scholarship and be able to point to me, and then the kind of academic enterprise can keep going and building up that kind of bibliography that we need in order to make the case to what we call glamour institutions. That's galleries, or I'm gonna mess this up, but hold on. Galleries, libraries, archives, museums, and records institutions. In other words, the places that keep stuff safe. And so those are the folks we have to convince. And to convince them, we have to convince people with money. So
sadly, yes.
Yeah. I don't know that we have enough to crowdfund on this one. At least not yet.
Not yet. Yeah, I think so. Hope your question.
Yeah, Hope gets a turn.
Hope gets a turn.
Do we want to pull one from the Twitter? Or do you want to?
Yeah, do you want me to pull one, or have you got them up there?
Yeah, if you have them up, go ahead.
Okay. Hey. All right, another one from Fallen Angel. How can we create a better narrative game space, narrative/game space, where the players feel safe to participate in the storytelling when they might be shy, unsure, or don't know how to do it?
Oh boy, welcome to my teaching life. Oh, so we switched the hat. And so this is something that I face. So the first time I taught the tabletop class, it filled in an hour in part because what none of us realized was this particular course number I was offering it under fulfilled a requirement for the English education major. So I had a whole bunch of future like middle school and high school teachers who had never played a game in their lives aside from Monopoly, but we're game. We're ready to go. And I think that one of the ways that we do this, of course, is through, and one of the ways that I do it in my class is I start simple with games that feel less intense, right? I start with For the Queen, which is a good way to discover that you're teaching a bunch of bloodthirsty radicals. I set out the decks on different tables. And every time we come to the end of a 30-minute session, and I'll be like, what happened to your queen? And they're like, well, after the acid attack. And I was like, excuse me, what? The acid attack? And so that's one way. It's like you start with a simpler narrative game that where it's easy to start. You don't feel like it's your character is developing across the answers, but it's not as intensive as like I'm building a character in Call of Cthulhu or whatever. And then the next step is safety tools, is to talk about the ways in which we care for each other at the space of the table. So that's the very second thing that gets taught, right? Is, how do we use an X card? How do we talk about lines and veils? And in fact, I say that's the second thing I teach explicitly, but it's implicit in what I do before I even meet students, which is for every class that I teach, I send out a survey, and I use the language in the TTRPG classes of lines and veils to talk about, what are they excited about? What are they nervous about? What are they really keen to do? What do they have prior experience in? All of those sorts of things. So I use that safety tool language from the jump. The other thing is, there's no one size fits all answer to that question. Of course, it's #complicated. But what I found with a lot of folks is it's a question of curating, right? Finding the right game that will make someone excited. And you never know until you really start talking to somebody what game is going to be the spark. Obviously, as an 18th centuryist, I find a lot of students get excited because they know that I'm an Austen scholar. When I tell them there's a Jane Austen RPG, there's actually several, right? Between Regency Cthulhu and Good Society and, Pride and Extreme Prejudice by Grant Howitt, right? There's even Austen for everybody. And so I think that that's another part of it. And so I use the next step that I use after something like For the Queen is the micro RPG book that was edited by the creator of One Shot RPG, James D'Amato. And that literally has one sheet RPGs you can rip out of the book. And so I fan them out and students make groups, and then you get a sense of, okay, are people looking for something to fight with? Are people looking for a cozy story? Are they looking for silly? And that's the next step. So yeah, I think it's a matchmaking thing, especially if there are friends that you care about. I think the biggest mistake that I've seen people I love make is assuming that bringing a game to a group is always going to be the right fit. Sometimes sometimes if you really want to play Blades in the Dark, you got to find your heist people, not your Brindlewood Bay people. There might be a lot of overlap in that, but, also depending on the day, sometimes I want to, be a terrible criminal, and sometimes I want to catch them with the power of friendship and uncanny horror, right?
That's amazing.
Thank you.
I really love this question, if you are able to answer to it. For the DMs who create the worlds for their players to delve into, this is another fallen angel, what are some important things they can add to create an inclusive world?
Ooh. I'm wondering if the answer, this is me treating this like my comps. Every time I had a question in my written exams for my comprehensive exams, I questioned the terms of the question. It did not go well for me in my oral exams when my advisor was like, no, but now you have to answer the question. But I do think that maybe one of the ways to reframe it is to take a look at the world you're building and think about it through the lens of something like a cultural or what we might call a feminist or kind of theorist, right? There's a kind of ethic of care. And what cultural critics and what race and power critics and what feminist and gender studies critics are all doing, if we do our jobs right, is to say, what are the underlying assumptions about the world that we're in? Or if we're looking at literary history or work of fiction or a world that you're building for yourself, what are the underlying expectations, right? Like, do you have a monarchy? Well, why? Why is hereditary monarchy as important to you? Is it a hereditary monarchy? Does it work in some other kinds of ways, right? And so I think it's a question of looking back on, is this capitalism? Does it need to be capitalism? Could we take a page from Brennan Lee Mulligan and make capitalism the enemy? What would happen if that was the case? Right? What would happen if, you thought that where conflict wasn't species against species? What if there were other reasons for people to be in conflict with each other? Goodness knows we have lots of other examples in the real world of completely reasonable and unreasonable ways that people kind of come into disagreement with each other. And so I think that might be the step that I would take. And that's the step some of my students for the TTRPG class will do, things like world building as a final project. And I will say, okay, so what are the underlying expectations of that world that you're building? And why do they have to be so? And could they be different? Can we imagine different? This is where the fantasy can meet kind of the science fiction, right? Let's look to the solar punk. Let's look to inspiration like Into the Motherlands, which says, okay, so we're not only going to imagine different future, we're going to imagine different past in order to give us the game that we want, which is to, as they say, imagine a brighter, blacker future, right? And it's an imaginary that is also removing the taint of the past to create an alternate history as well as an alternate future. And I think those are really good kind of ways to kind of think. And I think looking to other cultures, not in an appropriative way, but in an inspirational way, our ways of moving through the world are not the only ones that work, and arguably a lot of ours aren't working right now. So maybe it's time to kind of look at other playbooks. And this is also where I don't think I ever hear anyone recommending weird utopian literature of the past as an inspiration for world building and actual play. Not to say that those utopias are perfect places, but there's certainly Herland is a really weird exercise from the early 19th century about imagining an egalitarian world. What would happen if that was your world? It would certainly look different and it'd be a different starting place.
Wow. Yeah. As a new DM, I am taking notes.
Yay!
I am horrible at world building, so I appreciate all of that.
Well, and I think that the general rule of you start small and you see what your player choices lead to, I think is also important, right? You don't have to have everything from the jump. And as I'm a very fly by the seat of my pants DM, generally speaking, except for that time that I DM'd for 17 people.
Whoa.
And one of them is in chat right now, who's Aovi has been spamming all kinds of useful links, and I appreciate her. That's my collaborator, Emily. Thank you very much, Emily.
They're very good. Thank you.
Yeah.
My turn, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a fantastic question. I wish I had thought of this question. From Garawa. As someone who's experienced more than their fair share of TTRPG live plays, what % of them have been evil campaigns, in quotation marks, in terms of the character's alignment? Is there a common theme to these, for better or for worse?
So far, it's been a very small percentage. And I think it's for the same reason that, so in December, I found myself talking to Abria and B Dave and Matt and Brennan and anyone else who would answer my question about total party kills, right? And they don't happen very often because they're very difficult, right? And they're not a great sign, right, of things going well for you. Brennan had only had one. Abria had never experienced one as a DM. Matt had only experienced one as a DM, and I think 2 almost TPKs. And B Dave had a whole lot more, and that's because B Dave does one shots, right? B Dave also does kind of shows where, by virtue of his reputation, by virtue of his showmanship, and by virtue of kind of the challenges that he sets for himself in his performance, either TPK is on the table or TPK is the goal, right? and I think the same thing is kind of true with evil campaigns, which is you kind of have to be intending it, and they usually don't last very long because people don't usually play well together in the long term, being super evil. And I think the other thing to note is, very rarely, at least so far, and we're still collecting data, so I want to couch this in that academic way of results inconclusive. Alignment doesn't seem to be a really big part of actual play. People don't seem to be particularly interested in using the signifier of evil, good, neutral, right? That seems to be something that also does seems to be something that, if you're talking about D&D play or Pathfinder play more specifically, the systems just kind of have it as like the appendix of their, it's vestigial, right? And so unless you've got people playing with the deck of many things, and then quickly you realize when they're playing with the deck of many things that they realize, oh, right, a bunch of these are related to alignment. What's our alignment again? Like, did we write that down?
Yes, exactly.
Is that somewhere? Because of course, like, actual play is much more interested in the idea that, these are 3-dimensional characters, that you're embodying a person who, no one is a villain to themselves, right? Everyone is the hero of their own story. So, you could argue that the Mighty Nine was an evil campaign for a long time. I wouldn't. That would be terrible. But you can make the argument. I mean, they were selfish creatures pursuing selfish goals. And indeed, some of them had stated alignments that transitioned across the shape of that narrative. But yeah, so I think I'm not seeing a whole lot of references. And if you have references that you're seeing, please let me know. My DMs and whatnot are open.
Just a quick follow up. Do you think that's something that will go from 1D&D alignment?
Oh, what an interesting question. Who knows? I mean, man, every time I think I can say something authoritative about what's going to happen next year, I realize that my job is descriptive, not proscriptive, because
yeah, of course, yes.
The last month alone has been a kind of series of who could have predicted it? Nobody. Anyone who tells you they saw all this coming, I mean, in terms of exactly how it was going to play out, is literally trying to sell you something, probably on a YouTube channel. But so, I mean, I think it'll remain vestigial. I don't think it's going to get heightened more. Not in a time when we are divesting a lot of things from species attributes, which was kind of one of the first places that alignment left. But, my home game is still the home game I do not run, but play in, has a couple of rules that are very much kind of haunted by past editions of the game. And one of them is that you can't play evil and you can't play tieflings because tieflings were historically understood as the evil race.
Evil ones, yeah.
But I think that I think we're gonna see alignment get an even tinier box. I suspect, if I had to guess. And again, I could be wrong, but my sense is that that's where play is going, is folks are just not especially interested in it.
Kind of pivoting a little bit. I would like to talk about the TTRPG space a little bit. Since you have such an in-depth background of, working and writing about women, what advice would you have for women who are trying to make themselves a pillar in the TTRPG community, if that's something you can speak to?
Oh man, what an interesting question. It's we're in such an interesting moment in terms of fame and establishing oneself in tabletop, right? Just across the board. And one of the things that I'm very curious about in the years to come is, where are the next tabletop leaders gonna come from, right? Like, after the people who are not my age, right? Where, like, and not, anyone who's not a millennial, right? Like, what's the Gen Z leadership gonna look like? And I wish I knew, because it's a continuing frustration to me, right? And Three Black Halflings called leadership on it in their interview last week. The biggest company in the space has been very slow to see the retirement or the removal of white male leadership. And that's the outsized footprint, right, of where you would go on the design side to kind of have a substantial voice. And a lot of the women that I don't want to say grew up, but like spent a lot of my time kind of watching get more prominent and powerful, like Kate Welch, are now in other parts of the gaming industry, having left TTRPG behind. I'm reminded a lot of my brother was a live tweeter before me. My brother was a sportscaster, which is a young man's game. And so he left to get a job that didn't require him to be up late at night, live tweeting games 6 days a week and traveling all over the world. It's a very exciting thing when you're young, and it's much harder when you're our age, right? I started live tweeting when I was 40. He stopped 10 years apart. There's an essay in that is percolating in my head. And so I think a lot about labor and the pathways to sustainable labor, because so much of what I'm seeing right now is that the most prominent people in the hobby all came to the hobbies and there's a great book called Not Getting Paid to Do What You Love by Brooke Aaron Duffy. If you follow me on Twitter, you may have heard me tweet about this. And this is a book about beauty and fashion influencers from a couple of years ago, and talking about how that labor market works. And she did 55 interviews with influencers at different parts of the kind of food chain. And one of the things that she noticed was a generational difference, that for millennials, and I think this is also true in the TTRPG space, you see a lot of what's called like the slash influencer. In other words, people who have a job, who actually have a career in an allied field, that then transition into a kind of online content expression that fulfills a creative urge that their other work doesn't allow, or is an alternate income stream, or a little bit of both. And so that's the millennial model, right? I am an embodiment of that, right? I don't have to tweet to live. I don't have to write for Polygon to live. I have a secure academic job. The next generation on the influencer side, as Duffy talks about it, sees the content creation as the career, especially in a time of precarious everything, right? If the alternative is a different kind of precarious job, but it's not seemingly aligned with my creative impulse, well, I might as well do the thing that barely pays me, that allows me to do something that I feel aligns with my identity, with my career goals, whether or not there's a clear pathway to compensation or sustainable compensation, because I'm not getting paid for anything and I don't have a clear track anywhere. And so that's the big question mark is, right, are we seeing now a kind of return back to the establishing of a new kind of labor that can be sustainable in both the design and the performance side? Or are we having folks kind of defer and then ultimately get moved back out into other kinds of parts of, other kinds of professional ways to make a living? I mean, I think about one person who I've watched on their journey and talked to a lot, who is very clearly, in many ways, reducing their kind of experience in TTRPG in favor of, leaning into voice acting, right? Which is an allied hobby, or not hobby, allied profession, dear God, union work, right? Has those kinds of labor protections. And I'm wondering how much of that's going to happen. And this is where I'm doing a survey that's coming out soon. That's going to have the reason why it's not out is because it needs to be approved by my institutional research board so that we know it's legit and it's doing all the right things. But one of the sets of questions that I'm asking is, how much time are you spending on this part of your labor? How do you get compensated? What kinds of work are you doing? What is the nature of that work, so that we can get an anonymous, robust data set that I can then go into more informational interviews with individual creators and say, like, here's the data we have. Tell me how this is similar to or different from your individual experience. And some people are going to want to be anonymous with that, and some people are going to want me to cite them, and some people are going to want me to do a little bit of both. But that's the goal, is to kind of get a more accurate sense of where we're going and what it looks like generationally for different kinds of creators. Jen Kretschmer has said, it's inevitable that the unions are going to get involved, right? Because at a certain point, somebody's going to see money getting lost on the table and protections for their workers being lost. And the question is, right, is it going to be SAG? Is it going to be somebody else? Is it going to be a new entity? What is actual play? It's this thing that's both often performed live, like theater, but it has a duration like digital, like TV. So nobody's figured it out yet, and it's not monetized enough for it to become a major part of the game. But I have a belief that it will become so in the not. If again, prediction is terrible, but it's very likely, if it continues in this form, I do not think it is sustainable. It will ultimately become something that has professional protections, or it will die, or at least a big part of the middle will die out, and we will see like a big and a little, and no space in between, and no sense of a ladder, right? No sense of you can get from the kind of let's put on a show space into the big professional space. Whether that ladder actually exists or not is also a big question. But right now, at least historically over the last couple of years, there's been a strong sense that there's something like a pathway. And we're about to see whether that's true becoming truer, becoming less true, or something else. And so, and this does indeed, to come back to your original question, because I swear, this is gendered, right? So much of this is gendered labor. So much of the bad history that I'm trying to figure out how do you write about in a book that's trying to elevate the form, how much do you talk about the kind of history of bad actors that have, which has also often been extremely gendered in terms of who had power, what the nature of the abuse and bad acting was, how it was facilitated by certain kinds of gender norms and other sorts of things. It's messy. And part of me wants to say, okay, so book one of the subject, and then let's push this down the road. But we can't entirely. Some of this is stuff that's going to, I think, ultimately come out in this book. But it's hard. And this is the part of the stuff that, again, keeps me up at night is, how do we talk about the history of women in this art form, which is a history of extremely powerful and amazing women who kickstarted this, right? Geek and Sundry is started by Felicia Day. So much of what Critical Role is does not exist without Marisha Ray. It just doesn't. That there are many other powerful and important and wonderful and trailblazing women, not enough. And so often they get overshadowed by dudes either who are well-meaning or dudes who are behaving badly. If I had a solution for how to dignify the labor of women across fields, man, I'd press that button so many times.
You're right, though. In that answer that you gave, it is kind of a terrifying thing to think about. Actual play becoming more professional, what with unions and stuff, and because for me, in my experience in working in the industry, right, I find that it's really fun to do what you love for work until you're getting. Until all this kind of you're getting paid for it, and then it's not fun anymore because it's work, Yep. And I feel that could happen with the TTRPG, actual plays, it goes from being something fun that you love and you're passionate about to being a job that you rely on. And I feel like that's kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, one of the questions that I have, so I've been writing what's called an interview protocol, right? Mm-hmm. So another part of getting institutional review for research is to submit the kind of open-ended questions that you want to ask your subjects. And you want them to be as open-ended as possible. So they're usually something like, tell me about blankety blank. And one of mine right now, I think, is tell me about what professionalism means to you in this space. Because I think that that's a word that gets thrown around a lot, and it means a lot of different kinds of things. And sometimes it has connections to clear professional norms and best practices. But I think there's also kind of this free floating, we're being professional as soon as money is involved. And that's really tricky. And I think we've passed the event horizon for most people where it's job-like or job adjacent. What the phrase Brooke Aaron Duffy uses in her book on influencers is aspirational labor. So it doesn't have to be compensated for it to be treated like a job. And what she found was a lot of people had been operating from the study of influencers by saying, they don't take it seriously. They're just, they were buying into the narrative that many influencers tell about themselves in their public persona of, I was doing this for fun and now I make $1 million a post, right? And which erases the fact that they do an enormous amount of labor and they're doing market research and they're going to professional conventions and all that sort of thing. And I think we're seeing that similar kind of level of professional effort for things that, are either being, the biggest and most important story. And this may be the opening sentence of my book. And I've written about this before. But the most important in terms of the history of this form story that Critical Role ever told was the story of its own making, right? Which is that we are a group of nerdy ass voice actors who are friends and we are playing Dungeons and Dragons on the internet. None of that is a lie, right? And Brooke and Duffy talks about this too. Influencers aren't lying to you. they're just not mentioning an enormous amount of the labor, or they're mentioning it in particular kinds of ways. And actually Critical Role talks more about labor than other places do. But what gets dominated in the story, right, is like that these are actor friends, and which erases the fact that there have been a lot of collectives of actor friends, and they have not gone well for any number of reasons. And good, bad, ugly, happenstance and what have you. And you need, and chemistry is great. But there's so many other things that go into it as well. And yeah, I mean, I think that professionalism is the story that people tell themselves. And I say this as in a world where I got my job, and when I applied to my job in 2009, the economy imploded. I applied for 30 jobs in my field because that's all that there was for that year. And over half of those jobs hired no one. And the academic job market has looked more grim ever since, to the point where the Chronicle of Higher Education started counseling academics to talk to their students and use the image of acting as the image for how the academic job market works, which is you're probably going to, do a bunch of shitty jobs, and your chances of making a living off of this are hot garbage. Yeah. And you've got to love it and blah, 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 blah. But professionalism is the story that gets told like it's a magic formula that will get you into a tenure track job, even though they don't exist, that will get your show into, 5 billion people on Patreon, or whatever. And so it's really, we've got to tell better stories and we've got to figure out better models, right? The whole world's on fire. And what I love about this form, because I don't want to poo-poo the people who are doing this for love, because I think what's really important and what I find inspiring about this form, and the reason why I champion it, I want to devote these years of my life to studying it and dignifying it, is that it is a place where people can be the masters of the stories that they want to tell in ways that commercial storytelling doesn't always allow you to do. And so that's a gift. That is an important thing. It is inevitably impacted by the market because we live in late stage capitalism and we have to eat, and there's no universal basic income. And it would be very interesting to imagine a world in which that was the case. But this is back to that thing of what are the underlying values and assumptions of the worlds that you're building, the worlds you're talking about, and can we imagine better? So long-winded, rambly walk through a bunch of the naughty thickets of my brain at the moment.
I love it. I'm here for it.
Yeah, 100%, definitely. Yes, I could have a 7-hour rant about capitalism, but we know your time is limited. So what do you think, Hope? One more question each, do you think?
I think, sure. Maybe, I don't know. I feel like, is there something you'd like to plug? What are you working on right now?
Well, I think I've plugged the survey and the research project. And so please, if that's of interest to you, you don't necessarily have to follow me on Twitter, although that's absolutely a thing you can do. My website is ecfriedman.com, where you can sign up for information about that survey once it goes live, as well as how to help out with other kinds of research projects. I write for Polygon, and if you go to the way that I can write more for Polygon as a freelancer is if people read the stuff I have and comment on it and encourage and say, like, we would like more about specific kinds of things, because those are the metrics, again, of the world in which we live. But yeah, so, and then Emily, since Emily is here, my colleague Emily Kugler from Howard University, we co-run a YouTube channel, Critical Prof, that is a little bit of a hybrid. It is where we put our academic research on 18th century and games and my TTRPG research more generally. It's also where I do I teach, of course, in the middle of an ongoing global pandemic. And so students sometimes can't come to class, but I teach an active learning classroom. So I record recaps of what we were doing in class at the end of each day. And we put them up on YouTube, and people seem to find them really interesting, or at least useful for thinking about how I teach tabletop games. If you are interested in how I ran a game for 17 people set in the 18th century, there's also a video about that there as well. And then I think I'm one of the 5 million people in the space who's like, and there's stuff that's coming up that I can't talk about yet, but I will. Yeah, I did not think that would be me until very recently, but apparently that is me very recently. And I, of course. Yeah, and I'm working, and I'm very public about the fact that I am working on a book. Title still in development, but I think it's gone from actual players to improvised worlds. I think is where it's moving towards.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah. And then someday, I just I want somebody to write it. And if it has to be me, well, I'll take one for the team. There's a larger history of Nerd LA that I think is of great interest to me. That I've realized more and more as I've been working on this stuff, that this all came out of something, and a community and a people.
That's wonderful. Damien, do you have anything else?
I did have one more question, but it depends how much time you have.
I'm good. We have not gone past my turn into a pumpkin time yet, by any stretch.
Maybe final question, unless Hope has one more after me. Because I've always wanted to know what year do you think TTRPGs, especially D&D, transition from in quotation mark nerds in a basement to mainstream acceptance in the zeitgeist?
Oh no! Oh God! Wow. So I will put into the chat a really good piece by Alex Chalk that I think makes the argument, I think, even better than I do. But I think that for me, it is that. So he talks about it basically like as a kind of, it infiltrates the culture more and more across the 2000s. And I would say for me, I think the flashpoint is somewhere in the late 2010s. Because there are references to D&D before that, fair number of references. But, you know, being on Community, even Stranger Things, is a look back and kind of setting it in a particular kind of remove. I think you could make the argument that just the dawning of 5th edition makes a more accessible game. And of course, you very quickly on the heels of that get Adventure Zone and then Critical Role and then Dimension 20. And those really kind of move us quickly in the next couple of years. In terms of the number of people who are producing actual play, I can say like that there's a bump in 2015 and a huge bump in 2018, and then of course the big bump in 2020 when everybody is remote. But the transformative bump is not when the first actual plays that we consider to be the biggies come online. It's when one makes almost $12 million on Kickstarter.
Yes.
Yeah. Yep.
So, and I would say like, we're, and in some ways we're still working on it. Right. So I've been soft pitching this book around, it's designed to be an academic crossover book, which is to say, I want it to be a book people can buy and read. Strange but true. And so when I first started pitching it around, I had to explain what the hell I was talking about. But as soon as last January, The Legend of Mox Machina came out on Amazon, I had people older than me who are like 18th and 19th century scholars who like, I know what you're talking about now. I've heard of that. And I mean, because some of them had been like, oh, yes, Glass Cannon comes to Columbus, Ohio every year. I know that. So you had a few before, but now I think, that touchstone, is in play. So it's, I think one of the challenges, and this is like a thing about scale, that comes back to that question of like Twitter followers and all that sort of nonsense, is one of the things that was really striking to me, because I made the mistake of reading the comments and, more importantly, the quote retweets on my most recent Polygon piece, which was which was the first curated like best games, best actual plays not playing D&D, which was a Sophie's choice, right? Like there were 10 more things just off the top of the dome that I could have included in that piece, but they limited me. And so I had to say, okay, I want to represent one system per show. I want to make sure as many systems are. I want to, I don't think Critical Role needs any more air, although I think they did a very good Call of Cthulhu, all those sorts of things. And still, of course, you get pushback, right? Because these are shows where you may not be talking about a big audience, but you're talking about a devoted audience. And we could talk for hours about the nature of the ways that audiences are constructed for actual plays, right? Once they find you and they love you, they stay with you. And so, I had some people who I didn't really listen to it, where it was like, oh, you're sad that the actual play that you love, that is yet another thing by 4 white guys, didn't make the cut. Well, sorry, all of these are trying to be more representative than that. But I had one person who was like, I don't think Polygon did their research. And I was like, oh, this is the line. This is the line where we draw it. No, you cannot say I did not do the research. Because let me roll out I do not often roll out my stuff, my labor, because I think there's so much more for me to learn. I think there's so much more for all of us to learn. I have one set of skills, which is that I can look at more stuff than people who are right in it doing the making, right? But I also don't know what it's like to be in that team room getting ready for a show or participating in a long running show or those sorts of things. I learn about that from talking getting ready for a show or participating in a long but it reminded me very clearly of the ways in which this is a kind of fragmented kind of space in those ways. And it's something that I come back to, again and again in my trying to understand this stuff. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Good answer.
Always more to learn.
Yeah.
Hope?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great place to call it. I can't thank you enough for joining us and sharing your knowledge.
It's my great pleasure.
It's you're absolutely fabulous and lovely to listen to. I could do this all night, but appreciate you taking the time.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me. It's always lovely to have these kinds of conversations, and I always come away with a kind of appreciation for the communities that people are building all over. And we're all little satellites that get to connect into each other, get to celebrate and be excited about different kinds of things in the hobby, which I think is really cool.
Yep. Excellent.
Damien, you want to take us out?
Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. If you want to check out our actual play, playing on Wednesday nights at the moment, Hope is running a fantastic game called Fantastic Kings and Where to Find Them. I hope to see you there. But yes, everybody have a wonderful night/day and take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.